All right, so welcome back, everyone. Last lecture for the week, and this is going to be relatively short too. But this presentation is going to be on just some aspects of technical report writing, some things that I want to make sure that you know, and that sort of thing. So, once again, Dr. Sears back with another Bluefield State University MIET, and I haven't put a number on this. I'm going to use the same lecture for both the underground and surface courses for the project because you're going to change some of the headlines for the report, but the general concept is going to be the same for both of these and other reports that you might encounter in the future. So before you get started, if you haven't already started, you might have already started, but here are just a few things that I want you to know about, reports and how to write good ones, right? So the first thing is a report is just technical storytelling. Reports still have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's still just writing a story, only you are writing the story about the technical details of whatever you did. Start with why, and then move on to how and to what. This was a theory developed by Simon Sinek, and he wrote about it, and I have, attempted to sort of use this sort of process about what to talk about at what parts of, of the report. And so I started doing this myself, particularly in introductions and abstracts. My, most recent history has been doing mine safety research. So a lot of those reports, start with why we're doing this, and that reason was basically almost always, to protect or to promote the health and safety of U.S. mine workers. That was why I was doing what I was doing. So, in this project, in these projects for the courses, why you're doing this, you don't want to necessarily just say because I'm forced to or because it's required for a grade in the class or something like that. No, instead, the why is that you've been tasked by, your company, whatever that is. You may have a name if you want, or just, forget about it. But you're being tasked by your company to analyze, the proposed mining on, each of these reserves, for the classes, right? That's why you're doing this. You want to, your company wants to mine this, and you're going to tell them what they can and can't do, right? And then move into how you did whatever it is you did. In this case, you'll be looking at, how you did your, production calculations, that sort of thing, or, overburden removal for the surface project or something like that. And then you can work, you can, start talking about what it is that you have done. So basically think of, the why as why you've been tasked with this project, how you then went about accomplishing this task, and then what is your results and conclusions and that sort of thing. So this is just one person's sort of example on the order to speak in. I'm sure there are others out there, but this has worked pretty well for me so far, I'll say. Consider the audience's perspective and knowledge base. Okay, so in this case, you think, the audience is me, but it's really not. In this case, from the perspective you should be writing from, is that the audience is mine management, that sort of thing, right? So that's the audience. But you may be doing reports for other reasons, right? You may be doing a ventilation plan, a roof control plan that has to be submitted to MSHA, and then it might contain a report. So who your audience is important because of the amount of details that you would put in a report, for example. If you're giving it to a very high level audience, you also have to understand their knowledge base, right? Is probably not mining engineering at that point. It could be still, which is fine. But once you get to a certain level, that's probably not the case, and that you need to understand. You need to understand who you're communicating to communicate effectively, right? And so these reports, they document, they inform, and they persuade, right? So you're not necessarily just informing someone of what's in the report, right? You're going to be keeping these reports for yourself as well, to document what you did, and in some cases these reports may be persuasive. Okay. The last thing I put in here is make the first option your preferred choice. If you are trying to persuade someone or something like that in a report, and you give them multiple options to choose from, psychology tells us that your best option, like if you want them to do, say, option 2, right? List that first. Make that option 1, and you'll have a higher likelihood that an external person will select that as their preferred option as well. So, title page. Some have mentioned the title page. On the left here is the last title page that I did for an actual report that I wrote. This hasn't been that long ago, a couple of months. Anyways, there's a title page. I used my company's logo. I didn't put who it was prepared for. That does typically go in there, even though there's not one in mine. But anyways, there's just an example of a title page. And here's an example of the sections of the report. Like you see, executive summary, introduction, that's going to be there no matter what. Conclusions or recommendations, a disclaimer if you have it, and references, will always, kind of go at the end. And then what's in the body of the report obviously changes based on, the content contained within it, right? In this case, I was looking at, multiple seam interactions. I was using LAM model to calculate, stability factors and that sort of thing, and stresses. And, so that was all on here. And that's why these, headings are what they are. So what's in a technical report? Like I said, there's a title page, there's an executive summary, there's a table of contents, a table of figures, a table of tables, sure. List of figures, list of tables is typically what they're called. Or maybe not, I say. So we'll talk about a couple of, reports that don't have tables of contents. Of course, you have the body of the report, right? That's, what's all the stuff that's inside, between the sort of introduction and the conclusions, right? Then we have conclusions and recommendations, a disclaimer or limitations if you need that in your report, and then, of course, references and appendices as well. So about the executive summary, right at last, typically, right? Because it's the first thing your reader sees, but it's the last thing you fully understand, right? You need to, all of your sort of information will be contained within the body of the report itself. So not in the conclusions or not in the conclusions necessarily. There's no new information in there. That just, sort of leads the reader where you want them to go. But you need all of that to put that into the executive summary. And it should contain an introduction in itself, right? That's a short introduction. And then, once again, in that introduction, you're going to say, why you're doing this, that sort of thing. And then you have the problem statement itself. So this is sort of the, what's the reason for the report, right? And then the solution, section is, your methods and findings, that sort of thing. And then conclusions and recommendations. So basically, think of it as basically a one-page summary. They can be longer if it's necessary, okay? But think of it as a shorter, summary of the report so that you get the information you need as concisely as possible. Then there's the rest of the report for all the details and that sort of thing. So short reports or technical papers may not require a table of contents. The last one I didn't do a table of contents. I considered it to be too short to really need one. And that was my preference for that. But I could have put it in there just the same. Technical papers, like you would see published at a conference or something like that, they're also in the neighborhood of maybe 10 pages. And most of the time don't require a table of contents at all. Just because they're, you're basically expected to just sit down and read the thing. So, no table of contents there. But what goes in the body of the report? And the answer to that is it depends, right? It depends on, first, back to why, how, and what, right? It depends on why you're doing the report, how you did what you did within the report, and what it's about, right? So that's what's, going to be in your sections, and they can change from one report to the next, right? It could also be sections based on prior precedent. We have always started reports with an introduction. That's just how we've always done it. There's no other thing to do, right? That's just the way it is. Prior precedent. And then it also depends on the audience as well, right? So there's a number of factors that kind of go into what you should put for, what your headings are going to be in the body of the report. And it's all, dependent on what's in it, basically. And so instead, your report's going to have sections like reserve estimation or reserve analysis or something like that, production forecast, equipment selection, pillar stability for the underground project, and so on. That's what your reports, sections are going to look at, and it should be, pretty clear based on what you're talking about, what the name of that section should be. How should your report be written? Typically, okay. You're describing completed work. Your focus is on the process and results and not yourself. So it tends to be past tense, right? Almost always. Third person. Okay, so you're not going to say I did this or we did this. You would say the team, or if you were referring to someone else, like instead of saying like you could do this, or you could say one could do something like that. So third person, and they tend to be in passive voice. We'll talk a little bit more about that on this next slide, because you may also want to consider active voice for certain parts. For example, the executive summary, discussions, and conclusions. Those can be active voice, and perhaps should be. They may be clearer that way. Proposals, memos, so different kinds of reports, where instead of saying, what's typical, the passive voice, for example, measurements were taken to evaluate ground stability. The active voice of this would be the team measured ground stability at 3 locations. So it changes the focus from measurements to the team doing the measuring, right? And so, like I said, for some reports, this is beneficial, and even some sections, perhaps. And so with that, I'm going to close out this presentation on my thoughts on writing a technical report. Okay, so just some information that you may not have been told, or you may not be able to find online about the structure, how to think about writing, how to come at it from a storytelling perspective, almost that you're telling this arc, right? And almost like a story arc and that sort of thing. You can go and do more research into those topics if you want to get better. But yeah, so with that, I'm going to close this out, and we'll see you next time. And next week we should be getting into some new new material. We're back in business. So we'll see you then.